Thank you. I'm so happy to be here today, and actually yesterday and today, because I've gotten just as much out of the speakers as I think everybody in this room has. I have two teenage sons, and a couple of years ago, one of them was in a school program that worked through the book called 7 Habits for Highly Effective Teens. And we heard someone earlier today talk about Stephen Covey, and this is a book that his Stephen Covey's son wrote, which is an adolescent version of the adult version of book that many of you are probably familiar with. So my husband and I decided to also go through the book with our other son, and in doing so, participate in the exercises that they have you do in the book. And one of them was to develop a personal mission statement. And in a way, I think this exercise was really asking us to define what success is in our own lives, which is exactly what we're talking about today. That was actually kind of a tricky assignment. That was the hardest thing I had to do in that book. And so I ended up basing mine on a quote from John Adams that you might be familiar with. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. So my definition of success is to be a leader in all aspects, taking actions that inspire others, whether it's my own kids or the people at Johnson Space Center, JSC, to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more. And I've been fortunate to be part of an organization throughout my career whose mission I passionately believe in, so that there are challenging and concrete goals to strive for. One of our astronauts who recently returned from a 6-month stay on the International Space Station talked about the excitement of living and working on the frontier. Again, this harks a little bit to Admiral Howard's talk yesterday. A frontier is defined as the farthermost limits of knowledge or achievement in a particular field. It's a place where explorers come and pioneers settle in order to push boundaries. Through human space exploration, we view ourselves and our capabilities differently. Our aspirations expand and our knowledge vastly increases, leading to technological advances, thriving commerce, and leadership earned through challenges met and overcome. A recent survey revealed that almost 50% of world-renowned scientists cite the Apollo program as the main reason they pursued a science career. So that paid dividends to our nation's economy, our scientific knowledge, and political standing for decades. And today's youth continue to be inspired by human activities in space, in part because of efforts like those highlighted by Barbara Morgan to engage students in competitions, in prizes, and in experiential opportunities associated with space. In 2012, more than 2 million teachers and 43 million students from 49 countries participated in student experiments and activities associated with the International Space Station. Millions of people from 170 countries watched the recent National Geographic show called Live from Space, featuring astronauts on the International Space Station. And concurrently, through social media, the hashtag #LiveFromSpace reached nearly 600 million unique users on Twitter. Human space exploration continues to spark the innate curiosity of children, encouraging interest in discovery through science, technology, engineering, and math. My own career, my life, has been profoundly shaped by the major human spaceflight programs of the last 30 years. I entered graduate school the same year the space shuttle flew for the first time, an event that really got me excited about pursuing research in space as a career and led to 2 shuttle missions that I was on dedicated to research. As we moved into the International Space Station era, I flew on 2 missions that were part of the International Space Station assembly and worked on the ground to determine how astronauts would train for and operate on the ISS. And my leadership role now focuses on moving exploration forward, utilizing the space station as a technology test bed and building capabilities needed for exploration beyond low Earth orbit. So let me talk a little bit about each of those. When I was in junior high and high school, NASA successfully carried out several moon missions prior to the government canceling that program. And as much as I was enthralled by space missions, as I think everybody across the nation and across the world was, it never occurred to me that space exploration was something I could actually personally participate in. Of course, women weren't accepted into the astronaut program at that time, and there were very few women in any of the science and engineering positions at NASA then. And although I was the top math student at my high school, I went off to college thinking I would major either in music or business. But I continued to take math classes. This was at San Diego State University, and through them got interested in fields that used math. And as I described yesterday, after changing majors several times, ended up as a physics major. And not too long after I declared that, the 1978 class of astronauts was chosen. That was the first class chosen specifically for a vehicle that was in development at that time called the Space Shuttle. And it included engineers, scientists, and doctors, as well as the first women astronauts and the first minority astronauts. Groups that were even much more underrepresented in technical fields then than they are now. And as a woman of Hispanic heritage, that was certainly an event that caught my eye. I had a chance to do a couple summer jobs in laboratories, one at a laboratory at UCSD, UC San Diego, and one at Los Alamos National Labs. I had a staff member there, a woman who encouraged me to go on to graduate school. And so I ended up going to Stanford and starting to work with a professor in the area of optical processing. As I mentioned, that first year at Stanford was when the shuttle flew, and I started to head toward a career in research engineering. A couple years later, as I was in the middle of my PhD program, Sally Ride flew for the first time, and of course she had come from Stanford. She had also had a degree in physics, and those were all things that made an impression on me. And it was also other students there. NASA had opened up applications for another class of astronauts at that time. And so other students started to talk about, well, they were going to apply. And you know, that was the first time I started to think about, well, how does one become an astronaut? How do you apply? What do you even do? And that was the year I actually wrote NASA and sort of got the first bit of information about it. I made a decision that I would apply when I got my PhD because I figured I'd be more competitive then. And that's exactly what I did a couple years later. I put in my application, but wasn't sure I would really ever hear anything back from NASA. I took a job with Sandia National Labs. And a couple of years later, I was called to come interview at Johnson Space Center. And it was the first time I'd ever been there. It was so exciting. Got to spend a week there. Got to undergo a lot of medical testing. But it was really my first chance to talk to astronauts, to really ask them about what the career is like day to day. As an astronaut, you generally will spend only a very small portion of your career actually in space. You spend most of it on the ground. And the more I heard about what you actually got to do, the more intrigued I became. I wasn't selected that year, but I was encouraged to try again, and I realized there were some things that I could do that would make me a better candidate. For example, I didn't really have very much operational experience. I'd spent most of my career either in school or now in a laboratory, and they wanted to make sure that people they selected would do well in an operational environment. So I went off and got my pilot's license and started flying in small planes. And then I decided that even if I wasn't selected as an astronaut, I really did want to work for NASA. I wanted to do what I was doing in optics and apply it to the field of space exploration. So I ended up talking to the professor that I had worked with at Stanford, and he hooked me up with somebody at NASA Ames Research Center, and they hired me to lead a research group there. And that's what I was doing a couple years later when they had another astronaut selection. I was called again to come interview, and that year I was selected along with 22 other people, 5 years after I applied, as the 13th class of astronauts. And it was good timing because the space shuttle flew very regularly in the early and mid-1990s. And just as I had hoped, my first 2 shuttle flights involved scientific research that really could not be done on Earth. From our unique vantage point orbiting the Earth, we studied changes to our atmosphere, and particularly the ozone hole. It was always a spectacular sight. We had to be up on the flight deck a lot, operating some of the equipment, also filming sunrises and sunsets, which happen every 45 minutes when you're in space. So that was a special experience, and I got to use the robot arm to deploy and retrieve free-flying science satellites on both of those missions. My second two flights were part of the assembly of the International Space Station, ISS. On one flight, we were the first shuttle mission to dock with the International Space Station, and then we transferred supplies. And then on my fourth and final flight, we added a major piece of truss equipment, and I'm going to show a movie from that flight, so I'll talk a little bit more about it then. On one of those flights, my third flight, I did have the pleasure of flying the flag of the National Women's Party that was used about 100 years ago as women were fighting for the right to vote. So I brought it up on the flight deck. This was my only flight. There were actually other women on the flight. There were three women on this flight, a crew of 7. One was a Canadian astronaut, and 2 of us were NASA astronauts. So we stretched out this flag in the middle of the International Space Station floating and took a nice picture of it. Something that I really enjoyed doing because I had recently been a member of the President's Commission on the Celebration of Women in American History, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca, New York, which happened in 1848. So this commission was formed in 1998. And it was a wonderful experience to sort of get that perspective of how women in American history had progressed over those years. And of course, it took a lot longer to get the right to vote than I think those women in 1848 had hoped. But it was very symbolic to me to be able to fly that flag and get that picture on that mission. After these 4 flights, that was when I started to go into management. I was named first deputy director and then later director of flight crew operations at Johnson Space Center. That's the organization that manages the astronaut office and our aircraft ops division. One of the very first things we dealt with, again, as I mentioned yesterday, was the loss of Columbia and everything that it took over a period of a couple of years to return the space shuttle to flight. We continued to build the International Space Station, and my job really then was to focus on making sure our crews were successful in space. And during that next few years, we saw the first woman command the International Space Station, as well as the first Hispanic commander of the International Space Station. About almost 7 years ago, I became deputy director of Johnson Space Center and then director at the beginning of last year. And I consider it an immense privilege to represent the JSC team and their accomplishments. Of course, we have since built the truss structure out to over 300 feet long, and again, my mission was brought up the first piece of that truss structure. We've added laboratories in addition to the one from the United States, from the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency, and we have supported a 6-person crew since mid-2009, representing 5 different space agencies: Russia, Japan, Europe, Canada, and the United States. The International Space Station has now been continuously occupied for almost 14 years, over 5,000 days. And at Johnson Space Center, we are responsible for keeping that program going, making it safe and successful and productive. So what do we use this space station for? Well, we really have sort of 3 main purposes. One of them is we do fundamental science research. We have a payload on board. It's actually attached to the outside of the station called the Alpha Magnetospectrometer, and it's trying to understand the nature of the universe, particularly the nature of dark matter and antimatter. It records cosmic ray hits. We're up over 20 or 30 billion cosmic ray hits since it was put up, trying to understand more about the universe. We also do basic research in biology, in material science, combustion physics, lots of different things. And then another way we use it is really research and technology that is more focused on direct payback to people on Earth. Lots of examples. One exciting discovery deals with the Salmonella bacteria, a leading cause, as you know, of food poisoning. Turns out when you take that bacteria into space, it becomes more virulent. And as they study why that happens, it helps give them ideas of how to develop a vaccine. And there is actually a company with a vaccine in development based on research that was done in space. And we continue to take examples of biological specimens into space to understand more about the basics of how that happens. We also do a lot of Earth resources, and in fact, this year there's 2 experiments going up that will be on the outside of the station. One of them is measuring sort of ocean wind and currents, and trying to, again, understand more about the Earth and the changing environment, our oceans and our atmosphere. We have that excellent vantage point from the orbits of the International Space Station. And then the third way that we use the International Space Station, it's part of our exploration program. We use it as a test bed for understanding new technologies and new concepts that will allow us to move beyond low Earth orbit and eventually get humans to Mars. Right now we're testing a new kind of regenerative carbon dioxide removal system that we're going to use on the spacecraft that we're developing to go beyond low Earth orbit. We have an agreement with Bigelow Aerospace to have an inflatable module that will launch next year, and we'll bring it up and inflate it and attach it to the International Space Station and understand the pros and cons of using an inflatable concept versus the sort of standard aluminum modules that we use in space today. And that inflatable technology, by the way, was originally developed at Johnson Space Center and then licensed more than a decade ago to this company, Bigelow Aerospace. We also have a humanoid robot on board called Robonaut 2. Again, technology that we have developed at Johnson Space Center, but which was accelerated a few years ago by an agreement that we worked with General Motors. They were interested in humanoid technology too to help reduce carpal tunnel syndrome in some of the workers they have in their factories. And we have a very different end use, so we want to be able to support astronauts in space. But a lot of the technology was the same, and by pooling resources, we were able to move much faster. Took up the torso a couple of years ago, and just recently we took up some legs. They don't really look like human legs because you don't really walk in space, but you do need to be able to grab on and move around, and so we're going to be trying those legs out in the next few months. As part of supporting ISS and making sure it can operate for many years to come, we have successfully at Johnson Space Center carried out the commercial cargo program. And now there are 2 companies in the United States that can deliver supplies to the International Space Station, and one of them can bring back samples and other things as well. SpaceX, which has developed a new rocket, the Falcon 9, and a new spacecraft, Dragon, and then Orbital Sciences, which has also developed a new rocket, Antares, and a new spacecraft, Cygnus. And we currently partner with Kennedy Space Center, one of our sister NASA centers, to carry out the commercial crew program. And we work with 3 companies under a reimbursable Space Act agreement, and another company, Blue Origin, under a non-reimbursable agreement, which we hope this will lead to commercial companies developing certified crew transportation systems within a few years. So this is part of the role that the International Space Station plays for us in helping to move exploration forward. A lot of what else we do at Johnson Space Center is part of moving exploration forward as well. We're developing a vehicle called the Orion, which is a spacecraft that can take crews beyond low Earth orbit and, more importantly, bring them back, which you come in at much higher speeds, which really requires a very different thermal protection system than what we have used on the shuttle or what companies are developing now to go to and from the International Space Station. So that is a critical part, along with a heavy lift rocket, which is being developed by another NASA center, of getting people to a variety of destinations beyond low Earth orbit, whether it's the lunar vicinity or a near-Earth asteroid, or eventually Mars or the moons of Mars. We're in the final months of testing and preparation for Orion's first mission. It's called Exploration Flight Test 1, EFT-1, scheduled for December 4th, and we'll test some of the top risks of that program in a two-orbit, 4-hour flight that will take this uncrewed spacecraft more than 3,600 miles above the Earth. That's compared to about 150 miles where the space station is. And that's the farthest we've flown in a vehicle designed for humans since the early 1970s. It will then return to Earth at a speed of almost 20,000 miles per hour and endure temperatures of 4,000 degrees before landing in the Pacific. So I hope you'll follow along various kinds of social media that we do at NASA on December 4th. We're currently planning the first human missions with the Orion. Initial missions will be designed to demonstrate technologies and capabilities that we eventually need to get humans to Mars and back. We're developing a concept to use a robotic spacecraft to use solar electric propulsion to capture and redirect a near-Earth asteroid into a stable orbit around the moon. And then later, when it's there, to send the Orion up with crew and be able to bring back samples of that asteroid to Earth. We'll be testing out capabilities like automated rendezvous and docking in deep space that are needed for future exploration. JSC has placed an emphasis on our commitment to be engaged outside our fence. In addition to continuing interactions with universities and aerospace companies, we've joined with non-aerospace companies in order to develop technology and problem solve using solutions across industries. I mentioned the General Motors example with the Robonaut. We also are working with lots of oil and gas companies, not surprisingly, since we're in Houston. One of them, a company called Petrofac, provides training to offshore workers, and they have to do a lot of emergency training. What if a helicopter, dunked in the Gulf of Mexico as they're taking offshore workers? Well, they're using our big indoor pool called the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, where we teach people how to do spacewalks as part of their training facility, and using some of our scenario planning and the kind of simulations and training that we do at NASA, applying that to the oil and gas industry. And they're helping us by doing some cost sharing in that facility. That was a facility we used 5 or 6 days a week, often 2 shifts a day, when we were assembling the International Space Station program. Now that it's assembled, we don't need to use it that often, but it's still a critical facility for us because it's how our astronauts train to do maintenance and repair on the outside of the station. By having this company come in, they can help share some of the costs for us, so one of those win-win situations. One of our biggest challenges at JSC today is making sure we're going to lead a global enterprise in human space exploration in the future. And so we have a change initiative going on right now at JSC 2.0. It's something I started, called JSC 2.0, to advance human spaceflight by being lean, agile, and adaptive to change. We're doing a number of things. We're transforming JSC by reorganizing, by changing processes and procedures, by focusing our technology development efforts on getting us to Mars, by changing some of our facilities, moving out and demolishing some, renovating others, and we'll be building a new building to support human health and performance in space, and by engaging in a variety of partnerships and collaborations. So this is an exciting part of what we're doing at JSC to make sure that we're moving into the future. I'd like to invite everybody to make sure you're sort of following along with what we're doing in human spaceflight and at Johnson Space Center. If you Google JSC Director News, you can sign up for a newsletter that I send out about every 4 or 6 weeks or so. Just a one-pager, gives you an idea, and I'd certainly like to invite you to do that. So before we get to questions, I did bring along a video, and I'd like to go ahead and show that now. And because I'll be narrating it, and I've actually got to look at it, I'm going to turn this one on, so if we can make sure this is live now, I'll use this to narrate it, and then we'll come back for Q&A. And if it's possible to turn down the lights in the front, that would probably help people to view the video a little bit better. So you can go ahead and press play. Let's see, is this working? Yeah, very good. So this is my 4th mission. This is obviously our crew down at Kennedy Space Center, heading out to the launch pad. This is in April of 2002. So this is several million pounds of thrust starting up, very exciting. Both the liquid engines on the shuttle itself and then the solid rocket boosters. I'm the one sort of in the middle, the commander and pilot in the first row. I'm the flight engineer, so I'm sort of in between them and just behind them, as you see right during the launch here, sort of talking them through various procedures. We roll as soon as we lift off in order to get into the proper orientation so that we can be in the right orbit to get to the International Space Station, which is inclined at 51.6 degrees from the equator. The liquid, the solid rockets burn for about the first 2 minutes, and then, as you're probably aware, they run out of fuel, they separate away from the rest of the shuttle, fall back into the ocean, and then those are refurbished and used on future missions. And that leaves the shuttle running on the liquid engines for the rest of the 8.5 minutes that it takes to get into orbit. Once we get into orbit, lots of things to do. This is actually on the next day when we're doing some burns that get us into the proper orbit in order to rendezvous with the International Space Station. And again, I was working with the pilot and commander as the flight engineer to really go through those rendezvous procedures in depth and make sure that we were doing what we needed to do. This is a view of us from the folks on the International Space Station. You can see that big piece of truss structure right in there, covering up almost the entire payload bay of the shuttle. And that's what we're bringing up to attach to the International Space Station. And now this is our view of the International Space Station. We're about to dock with that sort of silver ball that you saw. That's the docking mechanism. And this is us looking out the windows on the flight deck, seeing the space station kind of come up to us as we're flying up to it. A view of sort of the moment of contact between the shuttle and the space station, and then it takes a few minutes to actually pull the two vehicles together. Our commander, Mike Bloomfield, was very excited because he was manually flying that approach. After a couple hours, we make sure we're good, airtight. We open the hatch, and you see us joining the International Space Station crew. Consisted of 3 people, a Russian cosmonaut who was the commander, and then 2 NASA astronauts who were actually members of my 13th class of astronauts, the hairballs, so it was nice to meet 2 fellow hairballs in space. Then we started transferring equipment. You can see you can put a couple things between your knees in addition to in your hands. Makes it a little bit more efficient to transfer things. But the next day is when, the main task. My job was to use the robot arm along with another astronaut to lift this truss structure, we called it S0, up out of the payload bay and move it around to attach it to the top or the zenith part of the International Space Station. So here I am along with Dan Bursch in the space station at the robotic workstation. Now, there's no windows where you are, so you're depending only on camera views. This is one of the great camera views that we had of the truss structure. We're actually out over the Middle East there. You can see the Gulf of Aqaba and other things, kind of distracting when you're trying to focus on moving that big piece of equipment around and not hitting anything. This is the very final part of the maneuver. You can see that kind of claw on the right, which is going to grasp a bar, make the very first connection between the truss structure and the space station. And then it'll clamp down. And that's, again, Dan Bursch and I. Dan was actually at the controls at the very final part of that maneuver. Then we started, over the next week, we did a series of 4 spacewalks. I was inside operating the robot arm, and 4 of the members of the crew went out in groups of 2 over those 4 spacewalks to do a number of things. First of all, they were making a mechanical connection, so we were deploying some legs, bolting them down, making sure this truss structure was well attached to the space station. And then we had to attach a bunch of power cables, data cables. They had to, use drills and all kinds of things to make all the proper connections. And what you're seeing now are views from the helmet cameras on these spacewalking crew members, so you can see them looking out at their own hands as they're doing these tasks using tools that are designed to, attach these bolts and do various other activities outside the space station. You can see a crew member on the end of the arm there. Actually, you can't really. You can see it's sort of a V, which is a piece of equipment the crew member's holding. I had to move him from one side of the station to the other. It took about 20 minutes. He said it was the best 20 minutes of the spacewalk because he just looked down at the Earth the whole time. This is what it looks like when crew members are coming back in from a spacewalk. First, they come into what we call the crew lock, which we then pressurize, open the door into the equipment lock, and they come out and get out of their suits and sort of do all those activities. This is actually back on the shuttle. We're, of course, attached. We invited crew members over for a Texas barbecue. This is one of our crew members, Wex Allheim, kind of showing off for his kids. He was doing a little video conference with his kids. Another crew member, Steve Smith, showing some of the fun you can have with fluids in space. So after we were attached for about a week, we'd really finished all of our activities. It was time to close the hatch, making sure we had the right belly buttons on both sides of the hatch, and get ready to actually undock from the space station and prepare to come home. So the undock is similar to the dock in that we have a team of people, the commander and the pilot and me as the flight engineer, working to go through all the procedures, and the pilot is the one actually flying the shuttle away from the International Space Station. You can see us flying away there. That's the space station in the background. We got to about 400 feet away. Sunrise happens really fast when you're traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. And then what we did is fly an entire loop around the International Space Station so that we could document it with photographs. And we bring those back to the ground, and it helps ensure that we've documented exactly the configuration of the space station to help prepare us for future assembly flights. So this is when we're about halfway around, and you can see people taking pictures with cameras and also using a laser ranging device to make sure we're staying the right amount away. This was really the last good view we had of the International Space Station at that point, and then we did a burn, move much further away. Then we spend a day sort of checking out all the systems on the space shuttle, making sure they're ready for re-entry. And then finally it's entry day. We close the payload bay doors and do all those things that prepare us for re-entry, including getting in our launch and entry suits, which is a little bit trickier on board because you've actually grown a little bit in space, so it's a tighter fit. This is the very final part of re-entry after we've gone through the atmosphere, heated up to some parts of the shuttle to 3,000 degrees. The commander is now flying the vehicle. Again, I'm the flight engineer sort of walking through different procedures. You can see in the heads-up display we're going through about 13,000 feet, about 300 knots. And this is the final part, the final couple of minutes or so of the landing at Kennedy Space Center. Once we get down to about 2,000 feet is when the commander flares up and prepares for the final landing. At about 300 feet is when the landing gear come down. I think you can see that in this view here. And then we actually land on the runway here, still going about a little over 200 knots, which would be quite a bit faster than an airliner lands. And to reduce wear and tear on the tires and brakes, we have a drag chute. You'll see that come out here, help us land more safely. But we have about almost a 5-mile runway. And so that, again, helps us land safely here at Kennedy Space Center. So that was the end of STS 110. And what I wanted to do now is show you just a few pictures. That was, 14 years ago. This is what the space station looks like today. Quite a bit different, as you can see. Very different. We have so much more on the station now and can use it in all those ways that I talked about. So I wanted to just show you a few shots from more recently from crews on board the International Space Station. That's about as long and wide as a football field, so that just gives you a little bit about the size. This is, of course, inside the station. It has about as much pressurized area as the inside of a 747 aircraft, so really quite a lot of room, several different modules that you have. That was the lab of NASA's lab. This is going into some of the Russian segment. This is back in the laboratory using some of the experiments. I think these next couple ones are combustion physics experiments, trying to understand about fires when you don't have gravity, which can both help us be safer in space and learn more about Earth. Butterflies and spiders, these are some examples of experiments that were tied to student experiments on Earth. trying to learn about plant growth and microgravity, again for two reasons: for our own future exploration and to understand more about the role gravity plays so that we can better grow plants on Earth as well. Let's see, this has to do with various different human activities. We're trying to understand how to keep humans healthy and performing well in space. Astronauts exercise for about 2 hours a day in order to keep up muscle mass, in order to retain bone. And these are just some of the examples of some of the resistive exercise that help the bone strength. This is how you measure yourself in space in terms of how much you weigh. We want to make sure astronauts aren't either losing too much weight or gaining too much weight during their 6-month stays on orbit. These are some of the experiments that we have. We have a freezer that we use to collect a lot of samples, particularly biological samples, and then we can then bring them home on the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft. This is a microgravity glove box where we do a variety of experiments. This is just learning a little bit about how you solder in space to do repairs. Again, you don't have the convection to move the bubbles out. This is the alpha magnetic spectrometer that I mentioned earlier on the outside of the station, and a view not only of the robot arm but of a specialized attachment called Dexter that can have more capability to do robotic activities outside. And here's Robonaut 2. This is, I mentioned we had the torso up first, and this is the torso. Learning to operate different kinds of switches and certain activities in space that we hope will allow them to do some of the more routine activities, leaving astronauts to be able to work on the science experiments. This is the cupola. That wasn't there when I was up there, and I sure wish it had been, because that's the number one favorite spot of all astronauts when they're on the space station, to look out and view the Earth. You can actually also see the robotic arm operations in many cases from the cupola, so you have a good view. And this is just a view. You can see Florida and the east coast of the United States at night in this view from the International Space Station. Let's see, I think this is over the Midwest. Actually you can see Michigan and the Great Lakes. Those are those dark areas. Again, just showing that we have this magnificent laboratory and spacecraft international in space every minute of every day, and I hope you'll be a little bit more conscious of that great vehicle now that you've seen this movie. So if we can get the lights back up, I believe we will have a few minutes for questions. So please, if you have a question, you can come up to the mic. Okay, how about over here?
Dr. Ochoa, is there enough public and political support for continued human spaceflight and to get a human spaceflight to Mars?
We'd love to get more support. So I think on a general sense, people are supportive of it, but as you know, it's a very difficult time for the overall budget for the government. And so as a government agency, we are part of that whole conversation of how much money people are actually willing to put into this. Of course, I see it not so much as spending money, but investing in our country, in our economy, in really good high technology jobs that have applications to many other industries. And of course, I think the inspirational aspect is something you can't overlook as well. I think that's one of the best things about our space program is that what we have been able to achieve in space have given people the idea that they can achieve anything. It doesn't matter what field you're talking about, that great things are possible. Yes?
Dr. Ochoa, I'm Tamara McIntyre. I'm the Deputy Administrator of the Idaho Division of Veteran Services, and I also teach at Boise State as an adjunct professor. And I have a student this semester who has expressed an interest in joining NASA once she graduates from college. And what advice would you give her as a young woman aspiring to a position such as yours?
Well, we're always looking for great people, people who have done well in some kind of science or engineering degree. So that's the basics. We have a program where we do have college students that come work at NASA centers. They actually get paid to do that, so it's not an unpaid internship, it's actually a paid internship. It's called the Pathways Intern Program, and I do encourage college students to look for those opportunities, because when we are hiring in people, those are the first people that we turn to, because we've actually seen them at work in our environment, and we've had that chance to see what their work ethic is like and what they've been able to achieve as a college student. Those are the first people we turn to when we're hiring early career people. A lot of people think you have to major in aerospace engineering, and that's not the case. We hire people in all fields of engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical, industrial, of course, math and physics, and other types of fields. And I should say, of course, it's not just engineering. We have a lot of really talented people in the professional areas, in our procurement, in our chief financial office, human resources. So there's room there for people. Now, I will say that NASA has been, over the last few years, in a situation where our numbers are coming down, both in terms of our government employees and in terms of our contractor employees. A lot of that was associated with retiring the space shuttle, and also the fact that we do not have a funded exploration program. We are building the Orion spacecraft, and we're building a heavy lift launch vehicle, but we don't have a program that really lays out all those missions ahead. And so we haven't hired as many people as we would like, since we're coming down in numbers, but I still encourage people to go after it, because I think it's such an exciting place. You know, we talked yesterday about really wanting that higher purpose in the career that you have, and one of the things I love about NASA is that we really do work as a team, and people just really focus on what we are able to accomplish in space. Thank you.
Hi. First of all, you're so cool.
You know, they never said that about me when I was in high school, but
I think you're cooler than Beyonce. And thank you for being here. I think all the guests have been really cool. But my question, actually, I wanted to follow up on something that you mentioned yesterday when you were part of the panel. And everybody on the panel had talked about how the riskiest thing was really being in charge of other people. And in your case, you know, life and death type of situations, and having to make decisions. And I wondered if you have, over the years, you know, developed a system for how you make those decisions. When you're looking at how you have to move forward, you have to make a decision. It's not clear there's no clear answer, whether this is the right decision or that's the right decision, but you've got to go forward. People are looking to you to do that, and you just have to make split-second decisions, sometimes lifetime decisions. Do you have a mental process that you go through that gives you the confidence that you went through a process, and even if the decision turns out not how you thought it would be, you still feel confident that you followed a process that helped you make the decision?
we talked a lot about this as an organization after Columbia, and I think the same thing happened after Challenger, although that was before I was at NASA. And because as humans, you know, we don't have all the right information, and we allow other things to, you know, to get in the way, schedule pressure and all those kinds of things. How are we best able to make the best decisions even with imperfect information? One of the things that we do talk about is making sure that we are getting input from a wide variety of people. So a lot of you have probably been in on discussions where you talk about the importance of diversity in the room, and that can mean a lot of different things. So it can you can be talking about gender and race. You can also be talking about you have different kinds of engineers or people who have different experiences in your organization. And so what we try to do now is specifically, you know, pull different people. And if there's somebody in the meeting who hasn't spoken up, to say, okay, you represent an organization we haven't heard from. We need to hear what you are thinking about. So we try to do that very deliberately, and when I hold meetings where I am the person making the decision, I do try to deliberately go around the room, and even if somebody hasn't spoken up, to ask what they're thinking about. I think it's important to give people a chance to speak in other ways as well. Say, so we have ways if you don't speak up in a meeting, we have anonymous ways of people providing information, particularly if it has to do with flight safety. So we have a particular system where you can anonymously just send a note, say, here's what I'm worried about, here's something that wasn't discussed in the meeting, and so it will get to the attention of the managers, because there are just human dynamics that make it very difficult sometimes for people to speak up in a big meeting, particularly if you're a person, three layers lower than the people sitting at the table. It can be hard to get that. When I'm polling people for go, no-go on flight readiness, we specifically ask each organization to say, did you have any dissenting opinions as your own sub-organization was preparing for this mission, for this expedition? And if so, what were they? And why did you, come to the conclusion you did? And we'll talk about that. And of course, we also have experts in risk analysis and probabilistic risk assessment, and we hear from those folks as well. So a lot of it is about being deliberate and realizing that there are different ways that people can make an input into that meeting. But you're right, you do have to make a decision and move on. However, by moving on, I also try to make sure people know, hey, if there is new information that comes in, some test result that happens, or something else happens on orbit with a piece of equipment that sort of changes the way you're reviewing, the risk posture of something. You need to make sure we hear about that. You need to let us know. Don't just think, well, you already made a decision. If there's new information, we have to hear about it. That's something else we try to encourage. Yes.
So the space station seems to be a mini UN, and things are fairly precarious with Russia right now.
Yes.
How is that impacting your work?
Well, that's, the whole international aspect is something I never thought about when I first went to NASA. And then I found myself in a situation in the mid-90s of actually going to Russia and negotiating with members of the Russian Space Agency and their contractors about how are we going to operate the space station, how are we going to train for it, what language are we going to speak. A very interesting aspect of my job that I never anticipated. And as U.S.-Russian relations have sort of had their ups and downs over that last 15, 20 years, we've sort of needed to ride that out in the space station program. So let's say overall, on a person-to-person basis, as we work with people in Moscow Mission Control, as we work with various engineers, a lot of it is that we depend on the personal relationships that we've built up over those years. We also depend on the fact that we both get mutual benefit from working together on the International Space Station program. So what I can say is over the last few months, on a day-to-day basis, with the things that we have to do to keep the station running and work through all those decisions that we need to get agreement on both sides, that has worked very much the same as it has worked over the last decade or more. Now, that isn't to say that we're not concerned about changes that are going on. And in fact, a few months ago, the 4 major space corporations that support space operations in Russia were joined together and essentially nationalized, 51% owned by the government. So something that hadn't happened in quite a while. And we've also seen people that we have worked with for a long time who led some of those being removed and replaced by people who have never worked in the space industry. The main corporation we work with now is just now starting to be headed up by somebody from the automotive industry in Russia. And so we do have questions about how that is going to affect how we move forward, because it's not clear that person or the person he feels he is going to be responsible to, they haven't had the benefit of understanding that sort of symbiotic relationship and the mutual benefits on both sides. So that is a situation we will need to continue to deal with. But fortunately, as I said, so far, the mutual benefit and the relationships have led us to operate very much in the same way as we have been.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ochoa. I'd like to ask you a question. As an astronaut, when you go out into space and you're coming back in to the space station, are there precautionary measures that you have to take that you don't bring something from outer space into the space station, then on Earth when you land? Do you have to go through some incubation period, or?
So there's really, when you're orbiting the Earth, there's really nothing that we know about there that would be of any concern. It is an issue when we talk about sending spacecraft to land on Mars and eventually to come back. So we're concerned about two things. Number one, we don't want to contaminate Mars, with something from Earth. So, everything that you develop on that spacecraft and how you work with it in a clean room and all of that is tightly controlled in order to make sure that we're not taking something to Mars that we don't want to, for two reasons. It could somehow be harmful, we don't know how, but also it could affect the science that we're trying to do there. You don't want to measure something that you're there, that you actually brought. You want to make sure you're measuring Mars, right? But we also do talk about when we do eventually bring a sample back from Mars, or when we do eventually land people and they come home, how would we do that sort of protection so that we don't inadvertently bring back something that we don't fully understand yet. And they dealt with that when we first sent humans to the moon. So you probably remember sort of the quarantine that astronauts were in. And I expect we'll do a similar thing, although we may know enough about the environment that we can convince ourselves that that's not really a concern. But we certainly do have people that look at that aspect and try to prepare for that situation. So I think we have time for one more question. Yes?
Well, I had two, but I'll just ask it. When you went into outer space, your first flight was in 2002, and what was the emotional experience of looking back at your home? And did that change any of your priorities or your perspective on life? It just seems like you're such a few people that have actually experienced that.
It really is a special experience to go into space, and we have lots of photos available that people all over the world can see because they're available on the web. But I will say it's still not the same as when you're looking out and seeing it for yourself. My first mission in 1993, we were studying the Earth's atmosphere, and as I mentioned, we were up on the flight deck looking out quite a bit. And what really strikes you is you're looking at the curvature of the Earth, and then you see this teeny tiny, very thin layer on top, which is what we were studying, the atmosphere. And you realize how incredibly fragile it is. It's so thin, and yet that's what provides life on Earth. And if it doesn't operate exactly the way it needs to, or it's damaged in any way, we cannot survive on Earth. So that's something you see much more viscerally from space than on Earth. You look down at country, you cross the United States in 10 minutes. And you see where I'm from, San Diego, you see that, and 10 minutes later you're over Long Island. And you go around the whole Earth, and you do get a sense of so much, you're not just looking at your state or your country, but you do tend to get this bigger perspective of how things in one part of the world can absolutely affect places all around the globe. So I think you get that feeling. And then I think there's just a feeling of you look down and you think, wow, everything I've ever known or loved or cared about is on that planet down there, and it really does make you think. It gives you a very special perspective, I think, one that I hope many more people in the future will have the chance to experience. Thank you very much.